The rain had been falling in intervals, as if even the heavens could not decide whether to weep or to hold their tears. The train station smelled of damp wood, rusted iron, and the faint sweetness of roasted peanuts from a vendor who packed up long before dusk. She sat there, the woman with the trembling hands and the unwavering heart, her suitcase tucked neatly by her feet, her eyes fixed upon the empty platform that swallowed up every promise and returned nothing. For 3 days she waited, 3 long days where the echo of departing trains mocked her, and the silence of no arrival carved deeper cracks in her chest. She had not told anyone back home. No letters, no confessions. Her family believed she had left for work, a temporary journey that would return her wealthier, wiser, settled. But the truth was braver and more fragile. She had left for love. A love that was supposed to greet her at this very station with outstretched arms, a smile brighter than the rain-soaked lamps, a voice that promised new beginnings. She clung to those words he had written, the way they danced across paper, "I will be there. Wait for me." So she waited. The first day, she told herself trains can run late. The second day, she convinced herself fate sometimes tests patience. But by the third day, patience had turned into quiet despair, and every passing stranger looked at her with the curiosity reserved for someone who didn't belong. Her reflection in the station's dusty window showed not just a woman waiting, but a woman unraveling. That was when the child appeared. Small boots splashing in shallow puddles, hair sticking to his forehead, eyes far too old for someone so young. He carried no umbrella, no fear of the rain, only a presence that demanded notice. He stopped in front of her bench, his gaze steady, his breathing quickened as though he had run a great distance to reach her. "You've been here a long time," he said, his voice thin but sure. She tried to smile, though her lips barely moved. "I'm waiting for someone." The boy tilted his head, water dripping from the brim of his little hat. "He's not coming." The words struck sharper than the wind. She flinched, clutching her suitcase as though it were the last thread tying her to sanity. "You don't know that," she whispered. But the boy only stepped closer. His boots left tiny muddy imprints on the cold stone floor. His eyes did not waver, eyes that seemed to hold secrets children should not carry. If he was coming, he would already be here. Her breath caught. She wanted to argue, to dismiss him, but the truth in his tone burned hotter than denial could cool. She looked away, blinking furiously to keep the tears from spilling. 3 days of silence, 3 days of hope turning sour, and now a child telling her what she had tried so hard not to accept. Then, almost suddenly, the boy softened. His hand, small, trembling slightly, tugged at her sleeve. "But, my daddy is coming. He'll be here soon." She looked down, startled. The boy's expression changed, carrying something both innocent and impossibly mature, a strange weight on his fragile shoulders. He whispered, "Will you marry my daddy instead?" The question cracked the air like thunder. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. The words replayed in her mind, not as a childish whim but as a plea stitched together by loneliness and longing. She stared at him, her voice gone, her heart racing. "What did you say?" The boy straightened, as though repeating himself required courage. "Marry my daddy instead. He's kind. He works hard. He needs someone. And I need someone too." The station fell silent. Even the trains seemed to hush, their distant rumbles fading as though the universe itself leaned in to listen. Her eyes searched his face, every feature etched in honesty, in desperation not his own but borrowed from a life that had given him too much sorrow too soon. She wanted to laugh, to call it the imagination of a child. But she could not. His words bore too much gravity. They carried the weight of a story she had yet to hear. The woman set her suitcase aside, kneeling so her eyes were level with his. Rain dripped from the platform roof, droplets scattering like shards of broken glass around them. She brushed a wet lock of hair from his forehead and asked softly, "Why me?" His answer was a whisper that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Because you waited. You didn't leave. Everyone leaves. Her chest ached. She had waited for love that never came, yet here was another form of love asking to be born out of her grief. A child's plea, raw and unpolished, carried more truth than all the letters she had clutched for months. In the distance, a whistle blew. A train approached, carrying with it the unknown, the future, and perhaps the father of this boy whose boots splashed defiantly against despair. She stood, her hand still holding his, feeling a shift within her, a delicate breaking and mending at once. For the first time in 3 days, she felt the stirrings of hope, not the hope that someone she loved would arrive, but the hope that perhaps she had been waiting for the wrong person all along. The boy's grip tightened, as though he feared she would vanish like everyone else. She squeezed back, her eyes lifting toward the train now pulling in, steam curling like ghosts into the night. Whatever came next, she knew this moment had changed everything. The child in boots had asked the impossible, yet in his impossible words, she had found the faintest flicker of a new destiny. And as the doors of the train opened, her heart no longer waited for a man who had abandoned her. It beat instead for the boy who had reminded her that love, in its truest form, sometimes comes not as a promise, but as a question whispered through the rain. The whistle of the arriving train was sharp enough to cut through the lingering fog of despair. The boy's hand clung tightly to hers, and though his skin was damp and cold, his grip felt oddly grounding, like an anchor dropped into waters she had been drifting across for too long. She hadn't expected to be noticed in her silence, let alone chosen. For 3 days, she was invisible to the world, and now this child in scuffed boots had pierced that veil with a plea so disarming she could barely remember how to breathe. The train screeched against the rails as it slowed, metal screaming like a wounded beast. Steam hissed from beneath, rolling out in clouds that momentarily swallowed the platform in mist. Passengers pressed forward, coats clutched around them, bags banging against their thighs as they braced for departure or return. The woman stood frozen. She did not move to join them. She only watched, her pulse fluttering wildly, while the boy's steady presence kept her tethered to the ground. When the doors opened, the first wave of travelers spilled out, faces pale from sleepless journeys, eyes sharp with expectation, some smiling, others hardened by absence. She scanned them with a reflex she couldn't control, searching for the familiar figure who had promised to meet her. For one last desperate second, she believed he might appear, stepping out of the mist like a miracle delayed. But there was nothing, no smile that belonged to her, no arms reaching through the crowd. Her breath faltered, then broke, and the truth carved deeper than before. The boy pulled on her sleeve. "That's my daddy," he said. Her eyes followed the direction of his pointing hand. From the far end of the train, a man stepped down onto the slick platform. He was tall, broad-shouldered though slightly bent, as though life had carved its burdens into his posture. His coat was plain, worn at the seams. His hair, dark but touched by threads of gray, clung damply to his forehead. His face carried weariness, but also gentleness, the kind that cannot be feigned. The boy let go of her hand only to run toward him, boots slapping against stone. The man's eyes lit up the instant he saw his son, exhaustion melting away into something fierce and alive. He knelt, gathering the child into his arms with a strength that made her throat tighten. It was not a casual embrace, it was an anchor of its own, the kind of embrace that declared, "You are my world, and I will never let you go." The woman looked away, guilt prickling her skin. She was an intruder here, a stranger who had wandered into a moment that belonged to them. She thought of leaving quietly, slipping away with her suitcase and her broken hope before anyone asked who she was or why she lingered. But then, the boy twisted in his father's arms and pointed back at her. "Daddy," he announced, "that's her." The man followed his finger, and his eyes met hers across the platform. She froze under his gaze. It was not suspicion that burned there, nor hostility. It was confusion, yes, but also curiosity, as though his son's words had already planted a seed he was unwilling to ignore. He straightened, the boy still clinging to his neck, and walked toward her with steady steps. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had endured silence for 3 days, yet now she wished desperately for words and found none. When he reached her, he lowered his son to the ground, though the boy's hand never left his. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deeper than she expected, calm but carrying the echo of sleepless nights. "My son tells me," he began, pausing as if testing the absurdity of the sentence on his tongue, "that he asked you to marry me." Her cheeks burned. She glanced at the boy, who nodded proudly, utterly fearless. Then back at the man, whose eyes held neither mockery nor dismissal, only patient waiting. Her voice faltered. "I don't know why he said that." The boy spoke before either of them could catch their breath. "Because she waited, Daddy. She didn't leave. She was still here." The man's expression softened, though shadows lingered in the creases of his face. He turned his gaze back to her. "You've been waiting here," she nodded faintly, "for someone who never came." There it was, the confession she hadn't wanted to voice aloud, hanging heavy in the misty air. But to her surprise, the man didn't pity her. He only sighed, as though her pain was a language he already understood. The boy tugged at his father's sleeve again. "She's kind, Daddy. Don't let her go." The woman's chest tightened. Kind. He had only met her minutes ago. And yet, in his innocence, he had seen something in her worth naming, something she had forgotten existed. The man crouched, leveling his gaze with his son's. "It doesn't work that way, son," he said gently. "People don't decide such things in train stations." "But you told me once," the boy insisted, his little fists tightening. "You told me that sometimes the people we need find us when we're not even looking. Maybe this is that." The man's eyes flickered with the ghost of a smile, a tired but unbroken smile, and for the briefest moment, the woman felt as though she had stumbled into a story written long before she arrived. Still, she took a step back, clutching her suitcase. "I should go. This isn't my place." But the boy rushed forward, seizing her hand again, his small fingers curling with determination. "No, don't leave." She looked down at him, her throat aching. His boots were muddy, his hair dripping wet, yet his eyes glowed with something purer than hope. It was faith, faith that she was meant to stay. The man straightened once more, his gaze moving between his son and her. He exhaled slowly, then extended his free hand, the one not held by the boy. It hovered in the air, uncertain but sincere. "You don't have to leave yet," he said quietly. "At least not before you've had a warm meal. It's the least we can offer." The woman hesitated. Her instincts screamed to protect what was left of her fragile pride, to walk away before she became entangled in someone else's story. But the boy's grip, the man's steady voice, and the hollow ache in her chest all conspired against her resolve. At last, she nodded. They walked together out of the station, a strange trio bound by invisible threads. The boy skipped between them, holding one hand of each as though weaving them into a promise neither adult had spoken. The woman felt the warmth of his small palm in hers, and though her heart still bled from abandonment, for the first time in days, she did not feel entirely alone. The road beyond the station was slick with rain, the lamps casting golden halos on the puddles. The man led the way, his pace unhurried, as though he knew haste would frighten her. The woman studied him in silence, the broad back that bent slightly but never broke, the quiet strength in his stride, the patience in his silence. She wondered what kind of man earned such fierce loyalty from a child, what kind of father carried both weariness and tenderness in equal measure. They reached a modest home on the edge of town, its wooden walls weathered but standing strong against time and storm. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bread and wood smoke. The boy hurried to fetch dry towels while the man lit a small fire in the hearth. The woman stood at the threshold, her suitcase still in hand, as though stepping fully inside meant surrendering to something she couldn't yet name. "Sit," the man said gently, gesturing to a chair by the fire. "You've been in the cold too long." She obeyed, lowering herself slowly, her hands trembling as the warmth reached her skin. The boy returned, draping a towel over her shoulders with surprising care. She smiled faintly, her eyes stinging at the gesture. The man busied himself in the kitchen, preparing what little they had. When he set the food on the table, simple soup, thick bread, she realized it was more nourishment than she had given herself in days. They ate quietly, the boy chattering between bites, filling the silence with tales of school, of friends, of dreams so big they barely fit in his small voice. The man listened with patient amusement, nodding here and there, his gaze often softening as it lingered on his son. The woman found herself watching them more than eating, her heart twisting at the sight. They had each other, and yet, something was missing. Something the boy believed she could fill. When the meal was done and the boy finally drifted to sleep near the fire, the man sat across from her, his hands folded, his eyes steady. "I don't know what brought you to that station," he said quietly. "And I won't ask unless you want to tell me. But I do know this, my son saw something in you. He doesn't say such things lightly. He's known loss." Her chest tightened. His mother. The man nodded once, the movement heavy. 3 years ago. Since then, it's been just us. Silence hung between them, but it was not hostile. It was honest, raw, filled with unsaid truths. The woman swallowed, her voice trembling. "I waited 3 days for someone who never came. And I thought it meant I wasn't worth being chosen." The man's gaze deepened, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Or maybe it meant you were waiting for the wrong person." Her breath caught. She looked down at her hands, words tangled in her throat. He didn't press further. He only rose, draped a blanket around her shoulders, and said softly, "Rest. Tomorrow is another day, and maybe a better beginning." As she sat there in the flickering firelight, the boy's quiet breathing in the background, and the man's presence steady as stone, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not love, not yet, but the first fragile stirrings of belonging. And for the first time since she had stepped into that station, she dared to believe she had not waited in vain. The morning broke quietly, as if the world itself was wary of disturbing the fragile peace that had settled overnight. Pale sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, painting the room in muted gold. The woman stirred beneath the blanket draped over her body slow to wake but her heart already restless. She hadn't realized she'd fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, but the warmth had lulled her into the first dreamless slumber she'd had in days. When she opened her eyes fully, she saw the boy curled up on a small rug, his boots abandoned by the hearth, one arm clutching a threadbare toy rabbit. His breathing was soft, his chest rising and falling with the ease of trust. Trust in this home, trust in his father, trust, astonishingly, in her. The father was already awake. She noticed him by the window, coffee mug in hand, shoulders squared against the early light. He turned when he felt her gaze. There was no surprise in his eyes, only quiet acknowledgement, as though he had expected her to still be there. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice carrying that steady calm she was beginning to recognize as his nature. She nodded, drawing the blanket tighter. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fall asleep here." "No need for apologies," he replied. "You needed rest." That much was clear. He crossed the room, placing a steaming cup of tea on the table near her. She hesitated, then wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her chilled fingers. It felt almost intimate, that simple gesture, and she lowered her eyes to hide the rush of emotion it stirred. The boy stirred then, mumbling something in his half-sleep. His father knelt beside him, smoothing his hair back with tender care. The sight struck her harder than she expected. She thought of the man who had promised to meet her, of how easily he had abandoned her. And here was another man, one who never abandoned the child who depended on him most. She took a sip of tea to steady herself. "Your son is remarkable," she said quietly. The man smiled faintly, though shadows lingered in his eyes. "He carries more than a child should. He lost his mother young, but he hasn't lost his ability to hope. Sometimes I think he's the one keeping me from falling apart." She nodded, understanding more than she wished to admit. Hope was fragile, yet in the boy, it burned so fiercely it could ignite those around him. The boy awoke fully a short while later, his first act to run straight to her side. "You're still here," he exclaimed, his eyes bright with relief. She smiled, though her heart clenched at the weight of his words. "Yes, I'm still here." "Good," he said firmly, as though her presence had been a matter of destiny rather than chance. Then he looked at his father with all the seriousness his small frame could carry. "See, Daddy, she didn't leave." The man only chuckled softly, ruffling his son's hair. But when his eyes met hers, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the boy's hope was binding them together in ways neither of them had planned. Later, they sat together outside, the sun climbing higher, the world slowly shaking off the remnants of the storm. The boy chased after a ball in the yard, his laughter spilling like music into the morning air. She and the man sat on the wooden steps, silence stretching between them but not suffocating. Finally, he spoke. "I should explain. About us." She turned to him, waiting. "I was married young," he began, his voice low. "We didn't have much, but we had each other. Then she fell ill, too quickly, too cruelly. By the time we understood what was happening, it was too late. She was gone before we could even say goodbye properly." His hands tightened around his mug, knuckles whitening. "I tried to be enough for my son, tried to carry both roles. Some days I think I've done well. Other days, I wonder if all he sees is the emptiness she left behind." She felt her throat tighten. Loss was a language she understood, though hers was not through death but through abandonment. She wanted to reach out, to tell him he had done more than enough, that the boy's light was proof of his love. But the words tangled in her chest. Instead, she whispered, "He sees you. And that's more than many children ever get." The man's eyes flickered toward her, gratitude softening the edges of his pain. "And what about you?" he asked gently. "What story were you carrying at that station?" Her breath caught. For a moment she thought of hiding, of brushing it off with some half-truth. But his gaze was steady, not prying but patient, waiting for her to decide. So she told him about the letters, the promises, the hope that had drawn her here. About the 3 days she had waited, clinging to every whistle of arriving trains, only to find nothing but silence. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to finish. "I thought it meant I wasn't worth being chosen," she whispered. His response was immediate, firm but quiet. "Or it meant he wasn't worthy of choosing you." Her eyes stung, and she looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his words. He didn't know her, not really, and yet he had spoken the very truth she hadn't dared let herself believe. The boy returned then, ball in hand, cheeks flushed. He plopped himself between them, leaning comfortably against her side as though he had claimed her already. "When people leave," he said matter-of-factly, "it hurts. But sometimes new people come, and they make it better." She looked down at him, startled by the wisdom in his childish voice. "And you think I'm one of those people?" He nodded fiercely. "I know you are." His father exhaled, a mixture of resignation and awe. "He's stubborn, if you haven't noticed." She laughed softly, though tears threatened at the edges of her vision. "I think I have." Days passed, blurring together in a rhythm she hadn't expected. Each morning, she thought she would leave. Each evening, she found another reason to stay. The boy clung to her presence with joyful certainty, while the father allowed her space but never pushed her away. She helped with small things, meals, laundry, reading stories at night. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a stranger's home and more like a place where she belonged. One evening, as the boy drifted to sleep with his head on her lap, she caught the father watching her from across the room. His gaze was unreadable, but something in it made her pulse quicken. "Why are you still here?" he asked quietly when the boy was asleep. She hesitated, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "Because he asked me to stay. And if he hadn't," she met his eyes then, heart pounding. "Maybe I would have left. Maybe I would still be lost. But I think I needed someone to remind me I still mattered." And he did that. The man's expression softened, his weariness lifting just enough to reveal something deeper, something dangerous in its tenderness. "He's not the only one who sees that." Silence fell, heavy with meaning. Neither of them moved, but in that stillness, something shifted, something fragile, undeniable, terrifying in its possibility. It wasn't love yet, but it was the spark of it, the spark she thought she'd lost forever. Weeks later, she stood again at the train station. But this time, she was not alone. The boy held one hand, the father the other, and together they watched the trains come and go. She felt no longing now, no ache for someone who had broken his promise. She felt only the quiet certainty that her waiting had led her here, to this moment, to these two souls who had given her a place to belong. The boy looked up at her, grinning. "So, will you marry my daddy?" She laughed, startled, her cheeks burning. She glanced at the father, who shook his head with a smile that was equal parts exasperation and fondness. "Not everything can be decided by a child," he said gently. "But some things," she whispered, her voice trembling as she met his eyes, "can be decided by the heart." The train roared past, wind whipping through the station. She didn't look for the man who had abandoned her. She didn't search the faces for what she had lost. Instead, she looked only at the boy in boots, whose faith had given her courage, and at the man beside him, whose steady presence had begun to mend her broken places. For the first time, she knew she hadn't been waiting for nothing. She had been waiting for this. And when the boy slipped his small hand into hers and the father's gaze held hers with unspoken promise, she understood. Sometimes the love we are meant for doesn't arrive when we expect it, but when we are finally ready to receive it.